Catapult Catastrophe by Stephen Lake. A group of 3 cats walked over to a barn and pulled out a large, powerful catapult and readied it to fire. They then checked the gears, the weights, and everything else on it they could to make sure that all was in correct working order. Everything, that is, except the basket. Unbeknownst to them, as the first 2 were completing their preparations for test firing, their other companion, Jingles, while stopping for a quick lick of his paw, spotted a butterfly that wandered playfully by and took interest in it. Jingles, being the ever-curious type, followed the butterfly up onto the arm of the catapult and into the basket, where he sat down and quietly watched it as it settled down on the arm where it opened and closed its wings gently. Meanwhile, as he was busy with this, the other 2 cats, his friends Titan and Fluffy, stood below him and argued over the settings on the catapult, how to tune it, and the best ways to operate it once everything was properly dialed in. However, because of all of their arguing, the 2 cats had completely forgotten to check the catapult for any possibly unwanted passengers who might have climbed aboard. After completing their adjustments, they pulled the lever to test the operation and let it fly. However, to their complete surprise and horror, rather than hearing just the expected whoosh, click sound of the catapult firing, an additional Mario sound accompanied it. Upon hearing this, both Titan and Fluffy immediately looked at each other in perplexity, confused as to what kind of ungodly, 1-in-a-million failure of their catapult might have caused that sound. However, it was when they turned around to ask their companion Jingles what his opinion was of the strange sound that they'd heard, they discovered that he was nowhere to be found. The 2 cats then looked at each other with an expression of both shock and horror, before turning their attention to the distance as the last glimmers of Jingles vanished through the treetops beyond. Both cats gulped nervously at this as they realized what their little argument over semantics had just caused. "Welp, there goes another one of his lives," said Fluffy flatly. "Yeah, and I'm pretty sure we forgot to check the basket before we let her rip," said Titan. Fluffy glared at Titan incredulously. "And whose responsibility was that?" he replied pertly. Titan shrugged. "Not mine. I was adjusting the range and windage." Realizing that there was nothing more they could do for their now-departed friend, Titan and Fluffy set about resetting their catapult and preparing it again to fire. However, it wasn't long after this that the 2 of them began arguing over its settings again. As they did this, unnoticed by either of them, Jingles returned to them from the forest, a bit disheveled and wind-whipped from the experience, but also very much alive. However, despite having been mistakenly cast downrange by his own failure to remain aware of his surroundings at all times, Jingles had still somehow survived. But that didn't mean he had learned his lesson from his previous experience. And, as though to prove that point, as soon as he reached the catapult, the same butterfly as before landed on it, causing Jingles to climb back into the same basket once again. The sound of whoosh, click, raw soon echoed across the area moments later as Jingles, just as foolishly as before, found himself once again channeling Superman through the skies over the valley they called home. And Titan and Fluffy, as expected, were just as perplexed at this strange repeating of events as they watched Jingles once more vanish into the forest beyond. "Did we just do déjà vu?" asked Fluffy in confusion. Titan shrugged lightly at this. "Nah, that's probably just someone else we don't know who looks like Jingles," he replied. Fluffy thought about this briefly for several moments before shaking his head. "Still, we really need to check that basket next time before we pull the lever." "Don't look at me. That's your job," said Titan. They then went back to resetting the catapult, adjusting the settings, and arguing over the specifics of its operation, just like before. Not long after this, despite having been launched through the air a second time, Jingles returned from his unfortunate bout of catapult-assisted air travel looking just as disheveled as before. But rather than learn his lesson from the last 2 times, he once again mounted the basket of the catapult to again stare gently at the fluttering butterfly who had, somehow, survived the 2 prior launches as well. However, upon checking the basket prior to firing the catapult, unlike before, Titan and Fluffy immediately noticed Jingles in the basket, causing them to fly into a rage and began growling, hissing, and screaming at him. "You idiot! Get out of that basket! We've already launched you into the forest twice. We're not going to do that again, they screamed. Jingles, being completely obtuse to the screams of his two companions, merely sat there mindlessly in the basket as he continued to watch the butterfly before him with wonder. Eventually, Titan and Fluffy climbed up onto the basket and threw Jingles out of it and onto the ground, after which they began screaming and yelling and preaching at him about the hazards and safe use of a catapult. However, as they did this, the butterfly that Jingles had been watching slowly fluttered away from the catapult arm and eventually landed on the release handle for the catapult. Upon seeing this, Jingles began to gently bat his paw at it. However, it didn't take much of this before the unthinkable happened. The sound of whoosh, click, YYH soon echoed through the air as the playful pawing of Jingles released the catapult, sending both Titan and Fluffy launching through the air and into the distant forest beyond. Upon hearing the departing screams of his two companions, Jingles briefly looked off into the distance as they vanished into the forest beyond before again turning his attention back to the butterfly. However, to his dismay, it had chosen to leave the area, flying up high into the sky and far away only moments earlier. As it did this, Jingles sighed sadly within himself. He had been enjoying watching the little butterfly as it danced about, even if it had led him to being thrown through the air and into the forest beyond twice in a row already. However, just as he was about to get up and leave, a squirrel came running up to him with an excited look on his face. Jingles, upon seeing this, merely furrowed a brow at the squirrel with aloof curiosity. "And what do you want?" he asked. The squirrel squealed and chittered and danced around excitedly. "That thing looks like fun. Can I give it a try?" he asked gleefully. Jingles thought about this briefly for several moments and then shrugged. "Sure, whatever. Just climb aboard and I'll get it prepped for you," he said. Why?" shouted the squirrel happily. He then climbed into the basket, put on his flight goggles, and braced himself for the launch. However, as he was doing this, a hound dog soon joined him in the basket. The squirrel, surprised to see him there, looked at the dog incredulously. "And what are you doing here?" he asked with perplexity. The dog shrugged and then slid on his own flight goggles. "It looks like fun, so I thought I'd join you," he replied. The squirrel pondered this briefly for several moments and then shrugged. "All right, that works for me. Let's kick this pig. Woo!"